Greetings, dear viewers, ladies and gentlemen. This is Addis Dialogue. Sophie Küspert-Rakotondrainy is a PhD student and researcher at the University of Birmingham, the UK, the Department of African Studies and Anthropology. And she started her PhD program in October 2019 and is expected to hand in her dissertation this year. She's my guest today in this edition of Addis Dialogue. We're going to talk about a host of issues, including her PhD, which is entitled Transformation of Hierarchies in Western Ethiopia, the Case of Mao. With the program, I'm Shifara Rakam. This is Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us and coming here.
Thank you for having me.
Just to kickstart our discussion, Sophie, can you tell me what Ethiopia means to you and what's so special about Ethiopia that you've observed?
Yeah, Ethiopia is a very special country. But of course it is not the country as in terms of the soil, but it is the people, isn't it? And I've really fallen in love with Ethiopia. I have got so many friends here. Okay. A lot of friends from different areas and who have very different lives. So I have friends here in Addis Ababa, and I have also friends in the rural areas, and it has taught me a lot, not only about Ethiopia, but also about myself in the interaction with other people. And it has been very important for me. Actually, since the first time I came to Ethiopia, I felt at home. Wow. And I felt that this was a place I wanted to be. And luckily, my husband felt the same way. Wow. So we really feel so comfortable here.
Wow. As far as my knowledge is concerned, Sophie, you have been looking into ethnicity and identity for quite some time. So I want to start our discussion with this. How come you become interested in identity?
Yeah, actually, the question of identity has been an important part of my life all since my childhood. I'm the daughter of German parents, but I grew up in Norway and then later in Madagascar. And I often got the question, what is your identity? Mm-hmm. And for me, that was an impossible question to answer. I didn't know how to answer that. And it was asked usually, to know whether I felt more German or more Norwegian. But it was asked from the perspective of this idea that every person needs to have an identity and find that true identity. And if you don't have that, and if you don't have an answer to that question, you're somehow lost. Mm-hmm. And even there is the idea that identity can be something that you can lose, and you need to find it. And it is only as an adult that I, through academic research, have found that identities are multiple and they are performed and negotiated in different ways in the way we live our lives. Yeah. And so it has been through the academic journey that I've actually started to answer that question for myself.
Wow, wow. I believe that, lots of Ethiopians can also share your experience or your situation when it comes to identity. Moving on from there, Sophie, you have been living in Ethiopia for quite some time. And I've learned that you speak Amharic also fluently, which is really good. So how did you become interested in Ethiopia in general and the area of your research in particular?
Thank you. Yeah, I actually came to Ethiopia for the first time in 2009. And I was amazed by this beautiful, wonderful country and the diversity of languages and ethnicities and cultural expressions. And I got the chance to come back some years later to do research for my master's. Mm-hmm. At that time, I was able to go to Benishangul Gumuz regional state in western Ethiopia, and I studied the introduction of 2 minority languages as language of instruction in primary schools. Okay. So that was how I got to know Western Ethiopia. And then in 2014, I moved here with my husband and our 2 children at that time. Our 3rd child was born in Addis Ababa. Okay. So since that, I have worked here in Ethiopia, and I worked particularly in the western part of Ethiopia. And I got to know the Mao area And I learned that this area is extremely diverse and extremely complex, and there are certain questions that I couldn't answer, what this Mao is and who these people are. And in the end, I saw that I couldn't answer these questions just by my work, which was mainly related to development work, language development. I cooperated with churches, and I really wanted to dig deeper into it. And that was how I started my PhD, because I really wanted to research this through a doctoral dissertation.
Wow, wow, amazing. So that's why you launched your PhD research. So can you tell me more about, your fieldwork experience? Did you face any experience? Can you walk me through some of the things that you went through?
Yeah, thank you. I had an absolutely wonderful time in my fieldwork. I spent a little bit more than 1 year going regularly to the area of Western Ethiopia. It is actually half of my area is in Benishangul Gumuz regional state, and then half of the area is in Oromia regional state. I lived there with local families. I decided not to rent my own place to live, but to live with the people, and that was important for my research. And we would just cook food and eat together. I would sleep the way they sleep. We would walk around, do the tasks that they did. We would go and visit weddings, and if there was mourning, someone had died, we did that. We would go to the market, to the field, and I met so many extremely wonderful, hospitable, friendly people.
Wow.
It was really amazing, and I decided not to take a translator or interpreter to the field because I really wanted this direct contact with people. And most of the people there, or quite a lot of people, could speak Amharic, so I could communicate directly with them. But also there are many people who don't speak Amharic, so I started learning Afan Oromo. Even people who speak different Mao languages, they usually are all fluent in Oromo language.
Okay.
And then the more Oromo I learned, and of course some greetings in the different Mao languages, the more I could communicate directly with them. And if I need a translation, then there were always people around from the same family. Maybe they had gone to school or in the community. So I really had that direct contact with people, which I wouldn't have had I taken a translator with me.
Exactly.
And that was very important to me, and we really started appreciating each other. It was not only that I asked them a lot of questions, but they also asked me, and we shared.
Wow.
And they got to know me, I got to know them. I lived with around 3-4 families, and then from there we just went to the neighbors and to the neighboring villages.
Wow.
So I went back to the same families, really to have this close personal contact.
Wow. So obviously you had wonderful experience so
Yes.
far. Let's talk about your PhD dissertation and the work that you are doing. Can you tell me the research findings, some of the things that you found out after you conducted those researches?
Yeah. So Mao is often understood to be one of Ethiopia's nations, nationalities and peoples. That means it is an ethnic group. But the puzzling thing is that there seems to be no specific content of Mao. Mao refers to people who speak different languages, have different lifestyles. Even people who self-identify as Mao may not acknowledge each other as proper Mao, because there are different definitions of what that means. And in the end, I asked myself, why is this concept so nebulous, so contested, and so heterogeneous, and what are its consequences? So what I found was that it is the position of an individual in the social hierarchies of their local communities that affects what Maoist means and does in their lives. So I kind of turned the argument a little bit upside down. Instead of saying that Mao means A, B, C, D, and then you have a list of characteristics,
right.
I said that the connotations, the purpose, and the relevance of Mao, it really depends on the condition of an individual, and these conditions are often experienced in hierarchical terms. So I looked at how Mao interacts with other characteristics of these people, for example, their socioeconomic status, maybe their ancestry, how that one is judged, also racial categories, how that relates. So I found that it is the lived experience of this person in hierarchical terms that makes up what Maoness means to them.
Mm-hmm. Moving on from there, Sophie, your research specifically deals with three things: identity, ethnicity, and hierarchy. So can you walk me through these three layers of things or entities? What does each mean?
Often, I think we believe that identity and ethnicity are the same thing. So one person has one ethnic identity, and that is what makes up their one identity. And the interesting thing is that when, from the perspective of my fieldwork, when I look at that, it is so much more complex. We often think of ethnicity as being this checklist. As I said, you have to speak a certain language, you should live in a certain designated territory, maybe you should eat a certain kind of food, you should clothe a certain way, you should have a certain lifestyle. And what I found was that reality is so much more complex. I can explain this maybe through an example.
Okay.
I met a lady, let us call her Ibrahima. Mm-hmm. So I met Ibrahima, and Ibrahima told me that she's Mao. And then I wanted to know what that means to her and how come she self-identifies as Mao. And then she said, well, it's because I speak Mao language. Fair enough. But then when I went to the neighboring village and I asked around there and I talked with people, they said, oh, you know, the village of Ibrahima, the people there, they don't really speak a Mao language. They are not real Mao because in their language, the word Mao has no meaning, whereas in our language, Mao means person or man or human. So I went back to Ibrahima, and I even found that she doesn't speak this language fluently. This is the language of her parents. She speaks Oromo and other languages. She has gone to school. So it is I couldn't find the definition of Mao through language. And then we looked at other things, and as usual, she was not the only case. As usual, it really boiled down to one thing, and that was ancestry. So she's Mao because her ancestors are Mao. And that seems plausible, right? Yeah. But then when we look at, do we really know how these ancestors self-identified? Do we know if they called themselves Mao and what Mao meant to them at that time? And actually we can't know, because this society is oral. We don't have any written evidence written by people who self-identified as Mao. I looked into archives, different documents written by imperial government employees, different reports, travelers who went to the area, and we can find that Mao is a quite new concept. It starts to be used more at the turn of the 20th century, at least in this broad area, and more throughout the 20th century, but then when these authors of these archival texts, when they used Mao, it's a bit unclear what they mean. Usually they used it seems, to just designate anyone who was not Oromo, but sometimes they used this word for any rural person, maybe people who couldn't pay their taxes. And sometimes they even used it to refer to people who were enslaved or had been enslaved or whom they saw as enslavable in some way. And we often believe that we can take the ethnic categories that we use today in the way we use them with the meanings that they have today, and we kind of export that into the past. And then we want to make the past fit to these categories, but actually it doesn't, because terms were used differently. They have different meanings at different times. So in the end, I found that the way we have to look at what Mao means for Ibrahima, coming back to her, it is in hierarchical terms, and it also depends on everything else that she is. And when we talk about hierarchy, let me just explain that a little bit more. We often think of, maybe we have an idea of a pyramid in our mind, right? So there's a group that is on the bottom, and then we have layers in the middle, and then we have some elites on top. And then we believe that we can take groups in society and neatly organize them in a nicely organized hierarchy, right? And we at all times we know which group is over which group or under which group. And then I found that society is so much more complex because there are Mao people in all of these layers. Actually, we can find people who self-identify as Mao, and I found that alliances between people, how they experience boundaries between different people, those go within and across different ethnic categories.
So vertical and horizontal relations, something like that.
Yes, well, actually we think of society as being these different groups, right? But people can't neatly fit and be put into these separate unities that are kind of thought to be unified within themselves. So I found that Mao is not one identity, and Mao doesn't denote one hierarchical position, but Mao is shaped by shifting hierarchies, and they don't represent one group within a hierarchy.
Wow. Can you also give me some examples of how you analyzed Mao in a hierarchical position?
Yeah, you want to know about the practices, right?
Exactly.
Because I think looking at practices is extremely important. Sometimes we only pay attention to what we say, our language, but that's only one side of the coin, because our language is often, where it relates to this idea of having one identity in this kind of language, but then in practice that shows us a different picture. So I looked at how people relate to each other in politics, education, in religion. I looked at marriage practices, labor practices, and really how people perform or live their identities in their day-to-day lives. And I can tell you another story if you want.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, please.
About a man, and when I first met him, I asked him a lot of questions, of course, and then I asked him about marriage, and he told me Mao people marry Mao. That sounds plausible, but then I got the chance to meet his family, and I met his wife, and we talked, and then I found that his wife does not self-identify as Mao.
Okay.
And I thought that's puzzling. He just told me that Mao people marry Mao. And he even said, oh, in our community there is no intermarriage. We don't have the opportunity to marry outside of Mao. And I inquired more into their practical lives, and that's where the practice becomes important. I looked at what he does, his work, and I found that he's landless. So he has to work on other farmers' land, and he lives in a situation of dependency to these other farmers. So with that, he occupies a very low rank in society. He's very vulnerable to poverty. He's vulnerable to exploitation. And his wife believes that she descends from enslaved.
So he's a tenant.
He's a tenant, and his wife believes that she descends from enslaved ancestors. And although she lives as a free person today, of course, that still plays a role in her life in practical ways. And with that, she also occupies this low rank in society. So when her husband told me that Mao people marry Mao, he didn't lie to me. But what he meant was that people who experience their identities in the same way and have the same idea of what Mao is, which is this very vulnerable, marginalized position, those tend to intermarry because they can't marry outside of that community. So when we look at who works for whom, under which conditions, we can see that many of these people actually are Mao people. But that doesn't mean that Maoness causes this situation of being in dependency to others, but there's their experience of being landless, of being poor, that of course strengthens the stigmatizing connotations of Maoness, which are one of the connotations of Mao. So I found that there is a kind of cyclic relationship here of Mao and being vulnerable reinforcing each other for some people. And that's the thing, we can't say that this is the definition of Mao, because we find other Mao people who have government positions, maybe they descend from landowners or slave owners, and they have a totally different experience of what being Mao is. So that's why I really had to pay attention to how people interact and what they do instead of only what they tell you.
Wow, wow. So it's obviously kind of intriguing, something like that. You know, because the definition of Mao in one place is different from the other?
Not only in different areas, but maybe even within the same community, depending on how your ancestry is being judged, how the community looks at who you are, which family you come from, maybe which life you live, which opportunities you've had in life, your parents have had in life. So yeah, it is really complex.
Do you think that this can be an area of further investigation, maybe an area where researchers can look into as part of their research?
Of course, I would also love to do more. Absolutely, I think this is just the beginning. I'm using some of the work of previous researchers in this area. There hasn't been done a lot of research, but some few researchers have been in that area. And we're just starting to understand more about this issue.
Wow. Okay, let's move on from there. And let's also talk about the Constitution. So what are the pros and cons of the Constitution vis-a-vis the people of Mao? Have you made any observations in this regard?
Yeah, I think that we can see the Constitution and ethnic federalism as an attempt to achieve fairness and to overcome cultural barriers that were put in place by previous regimes. And I also think that, well, the Constitution has opened opportunities for people. For example, in one part of my area of research, as I said, there are different parts, and one of the areas is in Benishangul Gumuz regional state, and there is a special district established which is called Mao Como Special Warada, and in that special warada, people who are identified as Mao can get positions in the government because this identity is protected by the constitution of the region. And in that sense, of course, yeah, the constitution has absolutely opened possibilities for them. But I think we need to be careful not to believe that, oh, since Mao now have gained a special warada, they all have the same opportunities. One thing is that actually less than half of Mao people live in this special warada. That's one thing. And the other thing is that there are still a lot of people who can't access these opportunities. Maybe they're rural, maybe their ancestry is not seen as very prestigious, maybe there are other obstacles. And as we have already seen, as I've tried to illustrate, what and who is Mao is not so straightforward. So when we say that Mao people govern Mao people because they now have a special warada, then we have to ask, well, who are these people and who are they governed by? So that brings us a little bit to maybe the downside, since you asked pros and cons. I think that the Constitution makes us believe in these static ethnic categories, right? And every person only belongs to one of these boxes. So we put the citizens, all of them, into these neat, nice boxes, and then everyone who is inside the same category shares the same characteristics, and that category kind of defines who they are. And as we maybe have already seen, a lot of people don't neatly fit into these, and what is actually the content of those, that is very fuzzy. And we find many people falling in between these categories, maybe especially people who experience to have an ancestry that is judged as maybe coming from enslaved people, because at that time of slavery, enslaved people took the ancestry of their master, and then they were adopted into that family. But that doesn't mean that they automatically became equal to the rest of that clan, because they were still believed to be not really true members of that ancestry, right? They didn't descend by blood or by biology from that clan, founder of the clan. And what we see today is that this idea of needing to be a true member of your ethnic group in ethnic federalism, that for these people that actually becomes a double obstacle and a double stigma, because they're already stigmatized because of their ancestry. And then again, they don't really know how to fit nicely into these ethnic categories, because the community says, well, you are not really blood descendants of people in this ethnic group, so how can you be true members? And then we find the idea of ethnic categorization actually reinforcing some of the power relations and hierarchies from the past that linger until today.
So, Sophie, do you think that ethnicity is irrelevant and multiculturalism and multilingualism should not be protected in society? That's what you meant?
It may have sounded that way, but it's absolutely not the case. I believe that ethnicity is very important, and it's an extremely powerful category, and it can do a lot of things, and it means a lot of things to people. And I don't want to go and say, oh, but it doesn't have any meaning if you have an ethnic identification. That is not what I mean. What I mean is that when I say ethnicity, yes, it is important, but it doesn't need to mean that we are faced with ethnic groups in society that are, you know, just referring to clear-cut, exactly separate ethnic groups. That is something else than just ethnicity. And I think that organizing society in a way where we think of, oh, everyone should just neatly fit into an ethnic category, that limits multiculturalism. And it limits our experience of being multilingual, multicultural, because it restricts us to being one thing and only that thing. And that is what I mean. But I absolutely think that multiculturalism and multilingualism should not only be protected, but even fostered.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. You are a foreigner, but you are so interested in Ethiopia, so I want to ask you this question. How come that you are so interested in Ethiopia in general, and the people of Mao and the Western people in particular? Can you tell me some of the reasons?
Yeah, thank you. As I said in the beginning, the issue of identity has been very personally important to me, and that the search for answers has brought me halfway across the world. And I found something in the Mao area where I thought that, wow, I can really learn something from this, also personally. And my research really goes into depth. It is a special case that shows the relationship between identity, ethnicity, and hierarchy, maybe in a very extreme way. Maybe it shows us more clearer than other places how these concepts relate to each other, because it is so extreme and it paints a more explicit picture. And I think in that sense the case can teach us a lot, because we can see things more clearly. And I try to really get an in-depth understanding of mechanisms behind exclusion and maybe the failure of some measures to combat marginalization. And I thought that this is something we can really learn from. Well, of course, you may ask, Mao people are 42,000 people or something like that. It's a very small group. These are very few people. How can this possibly be relevant, right, for the rest of the country or even the rest of the world? And anthropology is the study of humanity. So what we're trying to understand is who we are as people, how we interact with each other in society. And I think an in-depth case of Mao, yes, it is not generalizable to other areas in the exact same way, but that can teach us more about what it means to be human, how we interact with each other. And in that sense, I think it is absolutely relevant for a bigger area. And as I said, I was asked the question, what are you? Who are you? And that was often asked in ethnic or national terms. And so I think that is not an experience that is particular only for me. And I don't think that that question only applies to Mao. But through learning about Mao, I think we can learn more about questions of humanity that are relevant for all of us.
Wow, wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. That's beautifully put. Sophie, thank you so much for coming to our studio and for giving us this wonderful idea. And good luck with your research.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Definitely, definitely. Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you as well for having been with us. Until I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me, Shfaralak. Stay safe and take care.